Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Linda Halleran. I am the Community Engagement Manager with Town and Country Federal Credit Union and want to welcome you here tonight. So thanks for joining us tonight for the first of a two-part virtual workshop series on getting a leg up on preparing, planning, and affording higher education. We offered this workshop last year and it was so well received and there was so much information, we decided that this year we would divide it into two sessions. So we'll be talking a little bit in a minute about what we're talking about tonight and then next month. In addition to Town and Country's members, I want to welcome the families from our school community who are joining us tonight. So we're happy that you've logged in with us as well. We all know that education after high school can be really expensive and it seems that the cost continues to rise. Plus, many young people end up finishing their education only to be buried in student loan debt. This debt is getting in the way of them reaching other goals once they're done with school, like getting their own apartment, buying a car, and many other things. But there are steps that can be taken before high school and even during high school to make affording education after high school a little bit easier. So to provide some strategies and insights and ideas into the whole college planning process, Town and Country has teamed up with the Finance Authority of Maine, or FAME, as you probably have heard of them, and invited two of their experts on this topic here tonight. In tonight's session, we'll dig into the aspects of planning and preparing and saving for higher education. And in the next session on April 7th, we'll focus on building a list of schools, comparing the offers and financing options when it comes down to getting ready to send your child off to school. So be sure to register for this second session at tcfcu.com if you haven't had a chance to do that already. And let me introduce our speakers so we can get going. Mary Dyer has worked in higher education for over 20 years, assisting students and families with planning and saving and paying for higher education. She is currently the Financial Education Program Manager for FAME and provides college access, financial education, and debt management services and training to Maine students and families, as well as the professionals who support them. Mary also serves as president of the Maine Jumpstart Coalition for Personal Financial Literacy, which is a nonprofit, volunteer-based organization dedicated to improving financial capabilities of Maine children and young adults through our schools in particular. Mary is joined today by Mila Tappan. Mila is FAME's manager of college access and outreach, and a FAFSA expert working with parents, students, and education professionals to support the families on completing this process and preparing to pay for higher education after high school. And when my sons were in college or we were planning to go to college a few years ago, I sure wish I would have known Mila and had learned a lot more about FAFSA back then. It was always a challenge, and I think she'll be helping to demystify the FAFSA a little bit tonight. Let's get started and welcome Mary Dyer and Mila Tappan.
Thank you so much, Linda, and thank you, Megan, and thank you to Town and Country for having us again this year. Obviously, this is a critically important topic, and we're really appreciative to have the opportunity to talk with you tonight and to share this information. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for inviting us into your homes this evening. And just say to you that, Mila and I, as Linda mentioned, have been in higher education for a number of years, and we're now with FAME, really focused on helping students and families plan, pay, and save. And of course, that includes the financial literacy aspect as well. Mila and I met about 20 years ago, both working in the financial aid office at the University of Maine. So we've been at this for a long time together. What is also great, I think, about what we bring to this topic is we're both parents. And so we both have young adults in college. Mila has an older son who's graduated and received his master's. I have a high school student. So we've been through this process ourselves, and we're still in this process. And so we fully understand what you're thinking about and dealing with and concerned about. And we hope to be able to share our experiences throughout the presentation, some tips and strategies that worked for us, or perhaps some things we learned after the fact that we wish we'd known all along. So we're really pleased to be here. And again, we're in this with you. The other thing I want to mention before we get started is FAME has extensive support and resources to help you. We noticed when Linda shared the Q&A, there were lots of questions that all of you had about planning and saving and paying. And we want you to know that Mila's team, the College Access Counselor team, there's 5 of them, including Mila, and they are available by phone, by email. You can actually meet with them via Zoom one-on-one, and they will provide you with support directly. In addition to that, FAME has an extensive catalog of presentations, videos, online resources, lots of tools and publications to help you. So I encourage you to check out famemaine.com for that. And then lastly, we also provide extensive FAFSA support in the schools. So we haven't really been in the schools for a bit. We're doing everything virtually, but we hope next year to be back in the schools, at least in some part, to be able to provide FAFSA completion help, support with understanding financial aid offers, and everything really soup to nuts to help you with this process. So I don't want you to feel like after tonight's presentation, if you didn't get everything that you need and you still have a ton of questions and you need help, that you don't have support, because we are here to help you. And Mila's team is just incredible in terms of that support that's provided one-on-one as well. So as Linda mentioned, this is a 2-part series. So tonight we're really going to focus on 3 key elements. I'm going to talk about things that you can be doing now to prepare financially. I want to have a conversation with you about communicating with your child and your family. That is such an important part of this process. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mila, and she's going to talk about savings and understanding the benefit of savings and the impact of savings. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on. Really, what's most important is that regardless of where you're at, it's never too early or too late to begin planning. And so some of these financial strategies, the saving strategies that Mila's going to talk about, if some of you have got a junior in high school and you're in panic mode, it's never too late. Now, it'd be great if you have all kindergartners and you've joined us tonight, but that's not generally the case. So just know that it's never too late to begin this process, and we're here to help. So let's talk about some of the financial strategies and how to prepare. What are the things that you can be doing now to get, as we say, get your financial house in order, to get things in order and lined up so that you're in the best financial position possible? So some of those tips I want to cover with you now. One of the key things is to work toward paying off any debt that you have. So think about, certainly your highest interest rate debts, any credit card balances, car loans, any personal loans, any debt that you are currently holding. Now is a really good time to think about how you can focus on getting that debt paid off. One of the questions in the chat, there were actually a couple of questions about, should I sell my house and, as a way to help prepare financially? Certainly paying off a home is going to give you an opportunity to have more available income, but there are lots of considerations, and every family situation is unique. The financial circumstances are unique, and you want to be sure that paying off that home impacts you in a positive way. If you're to pay off that home and put $200,000-$300,000 into a savings account, that will have some impact on financial aid eligibility. Mila's going to show you some examples of that later. It's really all about your situation, what you do with the money. And frankly, if you have a mortgage that has a very, very low interest rate, mine is under 3% right now because I refinanced during the good times. Maybe that's not the best strategy. But again, that's a conversation that you want to have with your, financial advisor. Talk to us. That's a one-on-one kind of conversation that we want to have. But it's a great thing to consider. On the flip side, now is not a good time to take on new debt or make a big purchase. So one of the misconceptions or things that we've heard, sort of myths that get proliferated around financial aid eligibility is, I'm going to take all my money out of my savings account so I don't look like I have any money, and I'm going to go buy something or, make a big purchase, so I don't have any money in my savings account. And again, Mila's going to demonstrate and actually show you the numbers of how these decisions can impact you. But really, the reality is the financial aid or the federal formula that's used to determine financial aid is largely income driven. And so moving money out of savings, some of those strategies, even paying off debt, frankly, the FAFSA formula and the federal formula isn't looking at the level of debt that you have. So you really want to be sure that those decisions that you're making make sense for you and ask those questions if you're unclear. But know that the FAFSA formula is income driven. And so unless you're going to stop working or reduce your income, you're probably not going to be able to impact that formula significantly. And if you do reduce your income, that's not going to help you with the ability to pay. So just keep that in mind. Now is not a good time to buy a really expensive brand new car, to add a second property, primarily because that's now money that you will not have available on a monthly basis to contribute toward college. The other thing you want to be doing right now is think about ways to increase your income. So are there ways to boost the amount that you're bringing in each week or monthly? You know, a lot of people at this time, as their students are getting ready to enter college, they pick up a side hustle. You know, we have a coworker who takes care of people's pets on the side. You know, she'll walk the dogs or, you know, provide doggy daycare, you know, those kinds of side hustle opportunities that you can incorporate to add to your income is a really great strategy. On the flip side, if you have a child right now who is high school age or working age, they should be working to increase their available income and their available savings so that they can contribute down the road as well. One of the questions that often comes up is, does it hurt if my child earns too much money? Does it hurt them in terms of financial aid eligibility? And the reality is, students can borrow or can earn $8,000, up to $8,000 in their own earnings before it is going to have any impact on financial aid. So really, that's another myth we want to debunk. Sometimes we'll hear students and families say, you know, I don't want my student to earn too much money because they might lose financial aid. And that's simply not true unless they're earning a significant amount of money. So you want to keep that in mind and use that strategy. The other one, and I think this is probably, if I were to highlight any of these as my sort of most important tip or most valuable tip, is to make sure you conduct an annual, at least annual review of your fixed monthly expenses. And this is all contributing to increasing that available monthly cash and that monthly income that's available to you. An annual checkup is essentially where you will look at all of your fixed monthly expenses. So think about your insurances, your car insurance, renters or homeowners insurance, your cell phones, your internets, your credit card interest rates, perhaps even your rate on your mortgage. All of those fixed monthly expenses. And you want to be sure that you're evaluating those expenses to make sure that you're getting the best deal. I think the number one place where you can save money is on insurance. So if you haven't done a thorough review of all of your insurances, car insurance, and all other types of insurance, it's time to do that, because you really can save sometimes hundreds of dollars over the course of a year when you go through that annual checkup. The other thing that I myself found was very helpful in freeing up that money in my budget. So I did that inventory. I paid off credit cards and really freed up as much money as I could. I diverted that money as my plan into my college savings account while my child, my oldest son, was in middle school. I really beefed up that amount that I was contributing to his college savings account. And then once he was in college, I stopped contributing largely to the college savings account and diverted it to a tuition payment. So essentially, this is an opportunity. Tuition payment plan is when you can actually pay for the cost of college, that annual cost or that semester cost, over that period of time instead of having to pay one lump sum. So figuring out ways to free up money in your monthly budget that you will eventually divert to a tuition payment plan is a really great strategy. The other thing critical is to evaluate your current spending and create a budget. One of the tools that I learned of recently is an app. A lot of people are familiar perhaps with Mint or some of the other budgeting apps, but I apparently, and I've not used it, so I can't really endorse it yet, but there's an app called You Need a Budget, and it's YNAB. And the financial coach that we work with at FAME has talked to a lot of families, and they have found this budgeting tool to be really, really motivational and really helpful. So creating a budget, developing a spending plan, and even better, creating one that's a college tuition budget. So imagine that you're paying college tuition and you're developing your budget around that payment. For some of you, certainly meeting with a financial planner or a coach or another expert might be an option. Usually there's a cost associated with that in most cases. But again, you've got FAME. Certainly your credit union or your financial institution is another great option. They often have support available to you if you want to meet with someone and look at your kind of entire picture, look at your debt, see if you can save money on interest rates, those kinds of things. So there are free resources available, but meeting with a financial planner, your accountant, somebody that can coach you through the process can sometimes be helpful. And then again, really, really important to begin creating that plan and that strategy for saving for college. Start looking at college costs and thinking about, what will my plan be? What is my strategy for paying? All great tools along the way. And again, FAME has a ton of resources in terms of that planning and paying strategy to help you along the way. Now, the next thing that's really important, and I keep saying all these things are really important, right? But having a conversation with your child about sort of your expectations around college, and we'll get into that in the next slide, but really important to begin to open up that dialogue in your household. One of the things, a couple of studies I want to cite here, there's a study from Citizens Bank recently that said 73% of millennials with student loan debt say that they inherited their financial attitudes from their parents and their family members. So that's no big surprise. You really are a key influencer to your child in terms of their money habits and their behaviors, even when it comes to student debt. Of that same study, 53% believe that if they discuss paying for college with their parents, they would have borrowed less. So that's pretty compelling. Having those conversations with your child can really have an impact long term. So the sooner that you can do that, the more frequently that you can do that, the better. Now, another study that we like to cite is a T. Rowe Price study. So despite how important having these conversations are, many parents, and 3 out of 10, in fact, would rather talk to their child about the birds and the bees or the dangers of drugs and alcohol than have a conversation about money. Money is still in many households a very taboo subject. Unfortunately, there's families just don't feel confident about having those conversations, and there's still some embarrassment and shame that can go with it. We don't always want to put our cards on the table and let our kids know that, we do have a limit, and perhaps we're not in the best shape that we'd like to be, but the dialogue is critical. And so you want to start early and often. The other thing in this process is you think about having these conversations and having an open dialogue with your child and with the rest of the family about money matters, is to really think about your own attitudes and the dialogue that you have when it comes to college costs and debt. What are the things that you're saying? What are the messages that you're sending? Really think about that. Is debt a positive thing? Are you having conversations about debt, or do you say things about student loan debt and framing it in a way that's positive, negative, or indifferent? It's really helpful to kind of think about that. The other thing is to think about your money influencers. So Mila and I often in financial aid sessions will get a question or a comment from a parent who will say, my neighbor told me, or my sister or brother told me. And sometimes the information that they share isn't always accurate or accurate for that family's situation. So you want to think about your money influencers and your child's money influencers. I know that with my son, we would have lots of conversations about college financing and kind of expectations and what we could afford to pay. And I would really get him on track with a plan. And then he would go to school and hear things from his peers, and it would sort of derail some of the conversations that we would have. So think about your attitude, your influencers, and your child's influencers, and really think about ways to mitigate misinformation or just values that perhaps are different from what you're talking about in your household. Having the discussion, like I said, putting your cards on the table and talking about college costs and your ability to contribute is really, really important. And I was happy to have the experience that Mila went through the college process with her older son before I did. So a lot of her tips and tricks I used with my son. And one of the things that she often would share with me is that with her oldest son, being really candid about what you can contribute, so that when your child is looking at colleges and looking at the overall cost, they have a sense of what the threshold is in terms of what you can offer. And so it's really important for them to have some level of information as to what you can contribute. And don't be afraid to set boundaries and share your expectations and set expectations in terms of what they will bring to the table and what they will contribute and what you can contribute and what that threshold is. It's very similar in terms of boundary setting when it comes to paying for college as it is, the rules that we have when they're younger in terms of bedtime and things like that, household rules. You really want to set those same boundaries when it comes to college financing. The other thing that you want to be sure to do is have a conversation with them about the various pathways and have a backup plan. It's all too common that we encounter students and families where the student has applied to one institution. They had a laser focus on one institution and they didn't have a backup plan. And in some cases, that one institution, they really can't make it happen financially. And so you want to have lots of options and backup strategies and other plans. So you want to be thinking about that early on and make sure that your child is exploring multiple school options and thinking about financial fit and having a backup in all cases. I've talked about student loans, certainly having a conversation early about student loans. I think one of the best strategies when it comes to student loans with your child is make it real and tangible. Show them, there's lots of great calculators online where you can show them the impact of student loan debt over time. So really show them, if you borrow this amount in your first year and you multiply that by 2 or 4 years or beyond, kind of show them that monthly payment and give them a sense so that it's tangible and it's relatable. And again, there's lots of great calculators out there. We have one on our website as well. And then lastly, getting the entire family involved. So I don't know about you, but I think this is the case in many households. But in my household, I'm the one who dealt with the college financing stuff. Like I'm the college for obvious reasons. It's what I do for work. But I think it's really important to make sure the entire family, your partner, your spouse, everybody is aware of what the plan is, what's happening, and sort of what you're doing to prepare. I think involving the entire family is critical. We have a colleague who has a monthly money meeting with her family. And I think that's a great strategy. And it doesn't have to just be around college financing. It can be around, vacation planning or just family savings or, spending leaks, that kind of thing. I think it's a really great habit to establish. Getting that family involved means that you'll have the buy-in and that you'll all have a bit of skin in the game and that everybody will be contributing to that common goal through their actions and their behaviors. So those are just some great tips, I think, to kind of spark that conversation. I am going to turn it over to Mila now, and she's going to give us some information about financial aid.
I'm so excited that you're here tonight and that you're thinking about these things earlier than some of the families that we interact with. It's great that you're starting early. It's just going to give you so many more options. So when thinking about paying for college, many people think about scholarships and financial aid. We hear about that a lot. I wanted to start by talking about those two pieces of the pie. We like to talk about paying for college as a pie, and the more pieces that you have, the more manageable it is to pay for college. So merit scholarships are something that come up a lot. And merit scholarships are the funds that are awarded to your student, probably based on the fact that there's very strong students academically. There are some limited athletic scholarships, not as many as people often think. And there are maybe scholarships offered by the academic department. These scholarships are wonderful in that they're based just on who your student is. They have nothing to do with your family's financial situation. So if you've got a student who's really strong academically, what you're hoping for is that the school is going to offer your student money just based on that factor. I do want to say that one of the things, though, that we want people to be aware of, I did not realize this until my son started applying to colleges and talking with some of his friends, is that not all schools even offer merit aid, though. So you want to check in with schools, and we're going to talk more about building a list next time around, but you want to check in with schools to see if they do offer merit aid. A lot of the most prestigious schools don't offer any merit aid because their students are all academically very high achieving. It's usually the schools that are that kind of next level down. They're selective still, but they really want to get those top-notch students in. And so they'll use merit aid as a way of getting them to look at their school and make it more financially viable to attend their school. When we talk about financial aid, though, that actually comes from the financial aid office. So every school is going to have a financial aid office, and they are going to take care of awarding the financial aid. Now, the financial aid in most cases is actually going to be need-based. And what I mean by that is that the school is going to have the student, and it is going to be the student who's applying for financial aid, even though parent information is typically needed. The student is going to be required to fill out a FAFSA. The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. And when you fill out that FAFSA, the school is going to use that information to determine how much need-based aid the student is going to be eligible to receive. There are some schools that require an additional financial aid application called a CSS profile in addition to the FAFSA. So the FAFSA, every school, but the CSS profile is used by schools that have a lot of money. So for example, here in Maine, Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby all require the CSS profile. So when awarding their own money, they do look at things beyond what the FAFSA requires. In both cases, with the FAFSA and with the CSS profile, they take all of this information that's provided and they boil it down to what's called an expected family contribution, so an EFC. And then what's going to happen is that the colleges are going to use that EFC to determine how much need your individual student has. The amazing thing is that all schools do basically the same thing or start in the same place when they're awarding need-based financial aid. They're all going to have a cost of attendance, and that cost of attendance to attend that school is going to vary by school. A cost of attendance might be $10,000 or $11,000 at a community college. It might be $70,000 or more at some other schools. So cost of attendance is going to vary dramatically by school. Now, when we talk about cost of attendance, one of the things I want you to know is that schools do recognize that there's more than just tuition and fees. There's tuition and fees, there's room and board, even if the student lives off campus, there's books, supplies, travel, miscellaneous expenses. So schools really do try to say, hey, we recognize all of these expenses come into play. So each school has their cost of attendance. They subtract out that EFC, and your EFC is going to be the same regardless of the schools you're applying to. And then that is how they determine how much financial need that you have. So the amount of financial need that a family has is going to vary from one school to the next, depending on the cost of attendance. Higher the cost of attendance, the higher the level of need. And Mary, can you go back just for a second? I think this is really important. Because sometimes people will apply to one school, maybe they have an older child, and they apply to maybe a little lower cost school. And because they didn't get a lot of aid, they think, I'm not going to bother to apply in the future. But the reality is that a student might not get a lot of aid at one school that's a lower cost school, but might qualify for a tremendous amount of aid at another school. So that's one of the things when we're talking about building a list of schools, we're going to go into more detail on this. But I think that's just important to keep in mind. Now, in the perfect world, every school would fill 100% of your students' need. And what that would mean is that every school, all it would cost you would be your EFC. So that's what schools try to do. That's what we wish every school was able to do, is to fill all of the financial need that you have. But in reality, most schools are not able to fill the full need that a student has. So what that means is that even our lowest income students, even our students who have a 0 EFC, it's recognized that they cannot contribute to the cost of education at all. Even some of those students don't have their full bill paid. Most of them don't have their full bill paid. So for those students, that's a real challenge. What we find with middle income families is that that EFC is often going to be much higher than anticipated. And in a moment, we're going to look at some EFCs. And I think, unfortunately, people are shocked the first time they see their EFC. It really throws them off. And so they might be struggling with both the fact that the students aren't getting their full need met, and then that's compounded by the fact that their EFCs are higher than they anticipated, and they're struggling to come up with that amount. Another thing that I think is just important to keep in mind is that summer earnings just don't go as far as they used to. You know, I'm going to date myself. I attended Orono. I graduated with my undergrad in 1988. And I remember that fall semester, the tuition was $750. So $750 for tuition and fees in the fall, and then again in the spring. Back then, even, I waited tables, made pretty good money. I could have paid my full tuition just by working in the summer. And realistically, that just isn't the case now. Tuition has gone up so much that, you know, it is much more challenging. So, you know, sometimes we run into people in our conversations who just think, well, you know, I'm going to have my student take care of it. You know, I had to pay my way through school, and they need to do the same thing. There are some schools where that still is possible to work your way through, but it's just not as much of a reality as it used to be. So how do you confront these things? You know, so I've kind of laid out, okay, schools don't meet full need, EFCs are going to be high. What do you do about that? What we want people to really try to do, to the extent that they can, is to start saving, and to start saving now. If you've already started, that's great. If you haven't, we'd love to have you get started. Because here's what we want you to know. And so many times this came up in the questions and answers, or in the questions that when you registered, you asked, is that savings is going to have little to no impact on your financial aid eligibility. And I think there are probably many of you out there really surprised to hear me say that, because the myth that's existed is that people continue to think that saving is going to mess up financial aid eligibility, and that is just not the case. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at those EFCs and how EFCs kind of come together. So an EFC, an expected family contribution, is actually made up of 4 parts. It's a contribution from parent income. It's a contribution from parent assets. It's a contribution from student income, and it's a contribution from student assets. So those 4 pieces come together, and that is what creates the EFC. For tonight, we're just going to focus on the parent side. So we're going to talk about the parent income and the parent assets. So the first thing I wanted to do is I want to talk about what EFCs look like based on income. And to make it really simple, we're going to assume that none of these families have any assets at all. So there's no assets on the table. All we're looking at is what is the standard EFC based on income. Now, the FAFSA formula is publicly available. If you're a geek like I am, you can actually do the worksheet, and you can do what we call a hand calc, and you can figure out your EFC. There's also some calculators online where you can go and you can calculate your EFC. So it's very transparent. So we know exactly how an EFC is going to be calculated. So what I have done here is I have taken 4 families who have incomes that vary from 60,000 to 105,000. In all other ways, they're exactly the same. 4 families, I will talk about what an asset is, I promise. Four members of the family with 1 in college. So you can see that with family A, with an income of about 60,000, their expected family contribution from income, the parent contribution from income, is a little over $3,000. That probably seems like a stretch, but maybe feels, doable. If we look at a family that's earning just 15,000 more, that EFC is almost doubled to over $6,100. And then we look at a family that's earning $90,000 a year, and that EFC jumps up to over $10,000 per year. And again, you apply for financial aid every year. So this is what every year the EFC is theoretically expecting that a family could contribute. And then family D, making 105,000, their EFC is about 15,000. I'm not going to be Debbie Downer here because I'm going to turn it around and we're going to make it positive. But what that means is that families earning $105,000, $110,000, $120,000 per year are going to find that at many of the state schools, they're not going to get a lot of need-based aid. And families just aren't prepared for that. So the fact that you're here tonight, and hopefully will be with us again in our next session, you're going to have ways of dealing with that and confronting that if that's your situation. Now, one thing I wanted to address just briefly is why are these EFCs so high and so unrealistic? A little piece of the formula, it's based on the AGI, actually. So this is the AGI that we're looking at here. And what happens with the formula is the formula has something built into it called an income protection allowance. So it basically says, hey, if you have this amount of income, the formula knows that you have to pay federal taxes, you have to pay state taxes, you have to pay Social Security tax. And then it says, but it also costs you an amount to run your household. And that's what the income protection allowance is. Why the formula does not work well for families who have, pretty decent incomes is because that income protection allowance does not go up as your income goes up. It also doesn't adjust for where you live. So the fact that we live here in Maine, it's a little bit better because the income protection allowance is the same whether you live in Maine or you live in New York City. The income protection allowance for a family of 4 is about $30,000. So for families who are making $50,000 or $60,000 a year, maybe they're able to run their households on $30,000. But if you've got families that are earning $110,000, $120,000, what we find is that the more money you make, oftentimes you spend more. Your house might be a little bit bigger, your heating bill a little bit more, your food budget a little bit more, and the formula just simply does not take that into account. So that is why EFCs tend to go up dramatically once we see families with incomes over $50,000 or $60,000 per year. Okay, so if you can just kind of picture what your income is, take a look at that EFC, and my guess is that might have caught you a bit off guard. My recommendation, as I mentioned a moment ago, is that you save as much as you possibly can. Now, a lot of people are going to say, but yes, isn't saving going to negatively impact my financial aid eligibility? Isn't savings going to make that EFC just that much higher? As Mary said a few moments ago, the reality is that the EFC is really an income-driven formula. Assets have very little impact on the financial aid eligibility, and here is why. First of all, for families who are earning under $50,000 per year, assets have no impact at all. Families that are earning less than $50,000 per year, built into the formula, there's something called skip logic. And if your income is less than $50,000 and you meet, 1 or 2 other really easy to meet criteria, you don't even have to provide any asset income information on the FAFSA. But probably most of you here tonight with us are probably earning over $50,000. So you're like, well, great for them, but what about, how do I deal with this? Well, then the next piece becomes what they even count as an asset on the FAFSA. So the good news is that there's a lot of assets, people's most common assets, for a matter of fact, are excluded from the FAFSA. So for example, your home is completely excluded from the FAFSA. So when you're filling out the FAFSA, you don't need to figure out your home value. You don't need to figure out how much equity you have in your home or anything like that. Your home is completely excluded from the FAFSA. Additionally, if you have a retirement account that's sitting out there waiting for you to retire, the value of that retirement account is completely excluded from the FAFSA, does not come into play at all. And then beyond that, if you have a small family-owned business with fewer than 100 full-time employees, that is also completely excluded from the FAFSA. So for many people, those are your most significant assets. So those are off the table when it comes to the FAFSA. So what is counted? We're going to be talking about things that are counted like cash, savings, checking, college savings plans, which we're going to talk a little bit more about tonight. Those are counted. Second properties, if you had a camp or something, the equity in that would be looked at, okay? But even then, what happens next is there's an asset protection allowance too. So there's an asset protection based on the age of the older parent that actually protects some of your assets. So when all is said and done, many people are going to find that the amount of assets that are looked at are really minimal based on all of their assets. And the maximum amount of your assets that are going to impact the EFC is 5.64%. That's the maximum amount that would be expected from your assets. And that's after the asset protection allowance, okay? Usually it's lower than that. So what I hope this demonstrates is when you look at this chart, I've said, okay, all of these people are earning $75,000. So we can see that based on a $75,000 income, their EFC from their income is going to be $61.56. Okay, so scenario A, they have no assets at all, no countable assets. Scenario number B, they have $10,000. So $10,000 in assets, let's just say it's in a college savings plan, only increases the EFC by $240. In scenario C, they actually have $25,000 in college savings. All that does is increase the EFC by $852. And then in scenario D, they have $50,000 in college savings, and it is going to increase their EFC by a little under $2,000. But think about all the options you have by having that $50,000. Now that's a huge amount, right? Most people aren't going to be able to save that amount, but even if you are, the impact on your EFC is really, really minimal. So I just hope that this information allows you to save with confidence, allows you to know that savings is not a bad thing. You're not going to be shooting yourself in the foot by savings. Instead, you're going to be creating a scenario where you have options. You have another piece in addition to merit scholarships and financial aid in order to pay the bill. Mary also talked about payment plans. That's another piece of that pie. And so savings just gives you that piece that makes it so that if the financial aid isn't quite as good as you need it to be, if there isn't as much merit aid, you have another way of compensating. So there are lots of ways to be able to save for higher education. So there are 529 plans. We're going to talk about those in just a moment. There are Coverdell's, savings bonds. There's a Roth IRA. There are trust funds. One of the things I want you to walk away with tonight, and we can talk about this more, you can always reach out to me and we can have a conversation about your specific situation, is that it is always better to save in the parent name than in the student name. So when we talk about the EFC and the expectation from assets, we talked about the parent being, after all of those caveats, being no more than 5.64%. If student assets are required, meaning that the family earns over $50,000, then it is assumed that 20% of a student's assets would be available to help pay for school, would impact the EFC. Okay, so always better to save in the parent's name rather than the student's name, if you have that choice. Okay, savings is beneficial regardless, but just that much better when it's in the parent name. So I wanted to focus just in our last couple of minutes on a program that we have here in Maine, and it's just one way to save for higher education. NextGen is Maine's 529 plan, And what, in full disclosure, we administer that at FAME. People sometimes will ask, well, what do you do at FAME? And I jokingly will say, we do whatever the state legislature tells us to do. The Next Gen program is another one of those that we have been asked to administer. So we do that at FAME. But what a 529 account is it's just simply a tax advantaged way to pay for higher education. So if you open up a 529 plan, you put in after tax money, so you've already paid taxes on this money, you get to decide how you want to invest the money, and then hopefully those funds grow over a period of time. And then when the student is ready to go on to higher education, then what you're going to do is you are going to find that you don't even have to pay taxes on the earnings. Now, keep in mind, you've already paid taxes on your contributions, but even those earnings are going to be tax-free as long as you use them for higher education. And that's why people like these plans and why they might use them to save for higher education. And when we talk about what the funds can be used for, what I really like about 529s, and this is whether it's the Next Gen plan or any 529, although we hope you'll really look at Next Gen specifically, is that the assets can be used at any accredited post-secondary institution. That's in-state or out-of-state, public or private, 2-year, 4-year, and even graduate school. So sometimes people think, well, I don't want to do that because what if my student doesn't want to go to school in Maine? As far as a 529 is concerned, you can use it not only in Maine, but out of the state, again, public, private schools, even out of the country. So if you were looking at a school in Canada, for example, we have an agreement, we meaning the United States has an agreement with many Canadian schools so that you could use your 529 funds at McGill or at Dalhousie or St. Francis Xavier. Those are all schools where you could use those funds. So they're really flexible in terms of they can be used at any accredited school. And you really want to be looking at accredited schools anyway, okay? Beyond that, these funds can be used to cover the following expenses: tuition and fees, room and board, computer equipment. So that includes not only the purchase of a computer, but even the software and the services to have internet access. So whether that be the Spectrum bill or whatever the internet service provider is, whatever the software calls for to run any of the programs that they need for school, all of that is a qualified expense when it comes to 529 plans. Any required equipment, imagine a student who's going to a culinary arts school and needs to buy all of their knives and other sorts of things in order to do that particular program. Those are also considered a qualified expense. And last but not least, room and board is also considered a qualified expense as long as the student is enrolled at least half-time. So what's great about 529 plans is they can be used at the vast majority of schools, and they can be used to cover the vast majority of expenses. So really, really flexible. And then the last thing I just wanted to touch on is the fact that what sets Next Gen apart for Maine residents is that we do have grants available for Maine residents. So for example, we have an initial matching grant. So if you were to open up as a Maine resident, if you or the beneficiary is a Maine resident, you can open up a Next Gen account with $25 and you automatically get a $100 initial matching grant. Once that account is open, if you continue to contribute to that account, what you're going to find is that your contributions are going to be matched at 30 cents on the dollar. So up to $300 matching grant per year. So if you put in, let's say $1,000, if you can find a way to put $1,000 into this Next Gen account during a calendar year, then what you're going to find is you're going to be eligible for that $300 matching grant. Mary and I have talked about the fact that even with our kids in college, we continue to contribute to our Next Gen accounts specifically so we can get that matching grant. Sometimes when you're paying for higher ed, $100, $200, $300 feels like it's not a drop in the bucket. But again, we continue to come back to that piecemeal approach, and every little bit makes a difference. And so that $300 every year really can make a difference. And then if you automate your contributions and you make 6 consecutive months worth of contributions, after 6 months, you get a $100 automated funding grant. The best part of these grants, besides the money itself, is that there's no additional paperwork. So if you simply do these things, you open the account, you put in the 25, you contribute throughout the year, you automate the funding, that all is watched on the back end. And once those things happen, your funds are automatically distributed into your account without you having to fill out an additional form or having to take an extra step, which I think is really great because we know a lot of people miss out on money because of the additional steps that are required sometimes to take advantage of that. So we just hope you'll look at NextGen and see if that's something that fits for you. You can go to nextgenforme.com, and it's not too late. I know a lot of the people here with us tonight have kids in high school. It is definitely not too late to set up an account and start taking advantage of that. So with that, let me turn it back to Mary, who's going to talk about some additional resources that we want to be sure that you're aware of.
Absolutely. And as Mila said, it's never too late. You know, those graduation gifts and birthday gifts and those kinds of things, those can go right into the college savings accounts. We do have financial wellness, a whole host of financial wellness resources available. You can visit famemain.com/myfinancialwellness. And we have lots of tools, tips, strategies. Also, we do sponsor a digital financial wellness tool called Enrich. So you can visit fame.enrich.org and you can sign up. It's free. It's non-commercial because we pay for it. So you're not going to be inundated with marketing emails. But there's lots of great tools in Enrich, courses, but there is a My Money personality tool. So when I talked at the beginning about understanding your money influencers and your attitudes and sort of your money personality, there's a tool in there that you can use and your student can use to kind of get a sense of your money personality and what are your strengths and skills tied to that. We have publications, tools, and calculators. Another resource in addition in terms of college savings planning, and there's calculators available as well, as you can visit savingforcollege.com to find more information in terms of different savings programs by state. And then just as a reminder, this is our upcoming webinar. It's April 7th at 6 p.m. And the link is there, although you can go to tcfcu.com and go to events and just sign up for that. But again, this session is where we're going to talk about building a list of schools, comparing financial aid offers and the various financing options that are available as well.
So one of the questions was related to a Roth IRA. If a student has a Roth IRA in their name, does that count as a student asset?
That would be considered a student asset if it's in the student's name exclusively. There are some age parameters and that sort of thing for them to be able to open up a Roth IRA, but typically it is in the student's name, and so therefore it's included as a student asset. Typically, the family or the parent would be holding the Roth IRA, so you want to kind of weigh that as you're looking at it. The other thing related to that is, you know, for families and parents who have Roth IRAs, it does provide the flexibility. They can use it for retirement or education. But if it's in the student's name, it would be. Now, as Mila mentioned earlier, there's a 20% asset maximum asset allocation for student assets. And again, for earnings for the student, that $8,000 in earnings that would not be assessed on that for that student as well. So just to keep that in mind. So there's another question here about 529s from another state. Is it worth transferring to Maine's NextGen? If so, how? I would encourage you to contact FAME and we can take a look at that. You know, certainly there's a lot to consider in terms of, you know, how the plan is structured in the other state. You can certainly open up more than one 529 account. So it's not really necessary that you transfer the money. You certainly could, but it's not, you know, you can have more than one account with more than one state.
And I just will say, Mary, that if you do decide to do that, you can have your rollover from one to the other count towards your matching grant. So, you know, like Mary said, you've got to weigh all the pros and cons of doing that. And you certainly can have more than one 529 plan, but that is one other little piece just to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there was a question related to it, Mila. Can you please clarify your comment on Roth in a parent's name being used for education, tax implications, etc.?
Well, you know, I'm not a tax specialist, so I'm not going to speak to the tax ramifications of doing that. I have some Roths myself, so I know it depended on what age I was and when we took the distribution. But for the purposes of filing the FAFSA, and this is also the case with the CSS profile, retirement accounts do not count, whether they're in the parent name or the student name. Retirement accounts, Roths, IRAs, all of those are completely having no impact on financial aid eligibility. Because I'm looking here and I'm seeing the question about UTMAs and UGMAs, which are basically trust funds. And even though these will, from a financial aid perspective, and I just want to be clear that whenever we're answering questions, it's about the financial aid perspective. The other ramifications, we're not speaking to those. But with UGMAs and UTMAs, the challenge is that even though the parent is the custodian, it is considered a student asset. So UGMAs and UTMAs are going to be required to be listed on the FAFSA, and they're going to be listed as a student asset. So from the financial aid perspective, they do have more of an impact than a 529 or other ways that families might save for higher education.
And Mila, I would like to go back to the Roth IRA question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you answer that again? Because I think I was thinking more in terms of distribution versus asset value. So a Roth IRA, because it's a retirement account, on the FAFSA, you're not reporting the value of a retirement account, whether
Correct.
it's a student asset or a parent
Correct.
asset. However, when the student takes a distribution to pay their to pay their tuition, their room and board, then it will count in the financial aid formula.
Yeah, so whenever you take a distribution from a retirement account, if it's going to be considered, income in some way, taxable or non-taxable income. And so it will have to be listed on the FAFSA when it's income. One of the things, though, to keep in mind is the timing of that. So when you file a FAFSA, so right now, this year, we've been doing FAFSAs for the 22-23 academic year. So high school seniors are filing a FAFSA for the 22-23 academic year. The 22-23 FAFSA uses 2020 income. So the income required on a FAFSA is for 2 years prior. So one of the things that you can do strategically, if you were going to use something like a Roth IRA to pay for higher education expenses, what you could do is just wait to take that distribution in the latter part of the student's college career, so that it's going to be showing up in income for a year when they no longer have to file the FAFSA. So, if you're going to be looking at, filing, taking it out when they're a junior, 2 years from that, they're no longer going to be in school unless they go on to graduate school. So it wouldn't impact them. So there's some timing things that can make that still have little to no impact as well. Because I do want to keep answering questions, but I did want to let everyone know that next week we start our financial aid information sessions that are really targeted for juniors and their families, although anybody is welcome to attend. And we're going to be doing a series of 4 of them. They're all the same, so you get to pick which of them you want to attend. And they're on our events page. So if you go to famemaine.com, you can see the 4 events and you can register for any one of them. Those are about an hour-long session that's specifically focused again on juniors and their parents to help them get ready to file the FAFSA next fall. So it's what they can do to get prepared, understand some of the specific questions on the FAFSA, as well as kind of what happens after the FAFSA is filed. So I'd love to have some of you join us for that session. Again, the first one is next Thursday night.
Great. There was another question. I'm just scrolling back to make sure we hit all the earlier ones. Mm-hmm. Should the 529 be in a parent name or the student's? If the student already has a 529 NextGen account, should the parent also open another one? And I'm not sure if you mentioned, Mila, that even 529 funds that are being saved by the student in their name are considered a parent asset. So it's that lower, that 5.64%, that minimum amount. So it's, even if it's in the student name as the account owner, it will be considered a parent asset on the FAFSA. In terms of whether the parent should also open one, there's only one matching grant, if you will, or grant that's going to be awarded or given to the actual beneficiary, the student, if you will. So I don't know if you want to hit on that a little bit more, sure. Mila, but certainly having 2 accounts that are earning money and you're contributing to them, that's always a good thing.
Right. So we recommend, because the grants are 1 per beneficiary, that, you know, a lot of people find it great if everyone can just contribute to one account. So, you know, my niece has an account and, you know, so her birthday, holiday gift, I will just give her money. My sister just puts it into that one account that she has. But there is nothing that prevents there being a separate account. So, you know, realistically, sometimes there are some family dynamics and some challenges, you know, with relationships within families. So you certainly can have more than one next gen account for a child. But whichever account gets opened first, that's going to be the account where that grant is going to be applied. Okay. So it's only one per beneficiary. So just kind of think about that and who's going to open up that account to start with.
And the other thing I might add too is if you are an adult learner, you can open a next gen account for yourself and get those grants that we talked about and make contributions for your college costs. And you can open a separate one for your child as the child is the beneficiary, and they would get their own grants. So, you know, that's another way that many parents, you know, they may have their own account in you know, in case they're pursuing higher education now or later, you know, going on to school at a later time.
Yeah, these funds, what's nice about these funds is they are not restricted just to children. So as Mary said, anybody can open up a next gen account. And one of the things, like if you were an adult who, even if you already had a degree, but you were taking a class here and there, you could use your next gen funds at that particular school, as long as it's an accredited school. You don't even have to be like matriculated into a program. The key is just that you're taking a course at an accredited school. So that can be really beneficial. So Mary, I'm seeing a question here that says, a student takes a gap year, does the FAFSA have to be submitted again? And 2-year prior taxes counted? Basically, yes. So you have to file a FAFSA every single year. So for anyone out there who's thinking that their student might take a gap year, what we recommend is that you go through the entire process as if your student wasn't taking a gap year. And one of the reasons that we want you to do that is first of all, it's good just to get familiar with the process, but there are some times that schools will only award merit aid from the admissions office to students who are graduating from high school. So we want students to be considered for that. And then if the student decides to take a gap year, they can talk with the school about whether they can still get those funds in the subsequent year. But when it comes to the FAFSA, then the next year, the student does have to file a FAFSA. A FAFSA does have to be submitted every single year. The good news is that in subsequent years, it's a renewal. It's just updating the income information and anything else that's changed. And that income information is going to go forward 1 year. So for the 22-23 FAFSA, it was 2020 income. For the 23-24 FAFSA, which is what, if you have juniors, you're going to be doing, it's going to be 21 income. So yes, it's just going to always be 2 years prior to the first year of the FAFSA. So 21, 22 FAFSA or whatever it might be. I know it's so
probably, yeah. We call it prior year just to confuse everyone. And I think that hopefully answered the question. It was, if you have a daughter applying for college in 2025, do they only look at 2024 net income?
So if the student is going to start college in 25, that their FAFSA that they will file for that year is going to be a 25-26 FAFSA. The 25-26 FAFSA will use income from 2023. But then the next year, the student will need to do their FAFSA again, and it will use 2024.
Thank you, Mila. It's like a brain teaser.
It is.
There was another question about a property sale, Mila. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to this. It's someone indicating that they're selling a apartment building at the end of the month, and how much will this hurt my daughter's financial aid package?
Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind is that, so we've talked a lot about income tonight, and that income is based on that particular year required on the FAFSA. And it is the adjusted gross income that is really the number that gets focused on. But assets are as of the day you file the FAFSA. So one thing, and you're not breaking any rules here, it's just like having a tax accountant who kind of tells you how the rules work. It's the same way when it comes to assets. Assets are as of the day you file the FAFSA. So for example, if you sell a building, an apartment building, from an asset perspective, you just want to be cognizant of the fact that you probably don't want the proceeds sitting in a savings account if you're going to turn around and purchase another building, for example, or if you have a reason that you're going to be, taking those proceeds and spending them on something else, good idea to get those spent before the day you file the FAFSA. Because if on the day you file the FAFSA, you have that sitting in a savings account, you would need to list that. Okay, so just make your decisions kind of based on knowing when the FAFSA is going to be filed, and try to have the rules work to your advantage, just like with your taxes.
Did you see the question that asked, that's in the Q&A? If you have 2 children going to school, can you have 2 529 accounts and both get the match? I guess that
Yes.
means one for each child.
Yes, because so as a parent, you can, because usually parents own the 529s only because you have to be 18 to own a 529. So a student can't own their own 529 until they turn 18. So oftentimes parents are who own them. But yes, as a parent, I have a 529 for Alex, my oldest son. I had a 529 for Noah, my youngest son. Both of them were able to get these grants. So yes, as a parent, you can set up 2 accounts, one for each child, and each of them can receive the initial matching grant, those annual grants, as well as the automated funding grants.
And one thing we didn't touch on, I don't believe you did, Mila, but we often get the question, what happens if my child, so in the case you have, you've got 2 children and they one decides to go a different path, perhaps it's an apprenticeship or military or some other training path or right into the workforce, and they don't end up going to college, and you've got these 2 accounts. You can transfer from one beneficiary to the other. The grants will not travel, if you will. The grants cannot be moved to that other student, but those contributions that you made and those earnings can be transferred to another child. So, and another relative. So if you have, college savings funds that you've set aside and neither of your children or your child doesn't attend, you can transfer that account. So there is some flexibility there, in the scenario where the funds don't get used for the original person that you saved for.
Yeah, if I could just even add to that a little bit more, Mary, because this does come up so often. People sometimes are hesitant to save in something like a 529 because they just don't know what their students' plans are. And so, my youngest son, for example, decided to, take a year off. One thing you can do also is you can just hold tight. What's nice about the 529s and the matching grants is that there's no time limit on them. So it's not like you have to use the money by the time the child turns a certain age. You can just hold on to them because a lot of times students do decide to go back later. But as Mary mentioned, the other option is that you can take your contributions and the earnings and you can transfer them to another individual, not the matching grants, but all of the other funds. The other thing too that they've done more recently is you can even use your earnings and your contributions to pay off federal student loans for the student or their sibling. So the big point that I think we would like people to take away is there's just a lot of flexibility here. And certainly we're happy to privately answer any of the specific questions that a family might have, but we really want people to ask those questions because sometimes something is holding people back from pursuing some of these opportunities or, saving in these ways when, we can probably provide information that will be helpful for them to make that decision.
There's one last question. You want to take that that's on the chat, and then we'll get ready to wrap this up. Can you see it? My student's a junior now.
Yeah, I'll let you take this one, Mila, because I was contemplating this. It's unique.
Okay.
So they don't file their tax return every year. They do it every couple of years. So it's a unique question. And I'm thinking about when you do a FAFSA.
Yeah,
is will not file going to be okay, or how's that going to?
I guess I would want to talk to this individual directly. So the simple answer is when you file your FAFSA, if you didn't have to file a FAFSA for that year, one of the options on the FAFSA is did not file. So if you literally did not file that year, you had no adjusted gross income, then that's what would be reflected on the FAFSA. Then if you had the next year where you had 2 years worth of income, you would then have, a bump in the AGI, I would think, for that year. What I will say is, and I am, certainly not a tax expert. I've never seen a case where people only filed a tax return every other year. So yeah, I'd want to understand a little bit more about that. But the short answer is, if you file taxes for that year, then that tax information is going to be reflected. If you don't file taxes, because there are plenty of people who don't have to file taxes. Either they don't make enough to have to, or they have types of income that they don't have to file taxes for. For a matter of fact, like Social Security is typically excluded from the FAFSA. A lot of people who get Social Security don't have to file taxes at all. So that is not an uncommon scenario. So it's really just going to come down to what year is required and what was your AGI for that year. And that's what is the biggest predictor of what your financial aid eligibility and EFC are going to be.
Well, I want to say thank you to both of you for sharing all this great information. There is a lot to take away and a lot to think about, and we appreciate your time. As you see on the screen, please feel free to reach out to Mary and Mila if you have additional follow-up questions. So I want to say thanks for joining us tonight, and be sure to register and join us again on April 7th.